Funny that there'll be a little reception after the lecture down in the atrium, and you're all invited. This is the Werner Seligmann annual lecture. The lecture this evening is named after the noted architect and educator Werner Seligmann. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Seligmann, he was the dean of this school between 1976 and 1990. Prior to coming to Syracuse, Seligmann taught at the University of Austin in Texas between 1956 and 1958. It was there that he became part of a small group of faculty who were later to be nicknamed the Texas Rangers, a group that included Bernard Hersley, Colin Rowe, John Shaw, Robert Slutsky, and John Haydock, all individuals who went on to have a kind of significant careers as educators themselves. As you may know, the impact that brief Texas experience had on architecture and architectural education was significant and continues to reverberate in various and sundry ways some 55 years later. After leaving Austin, Seligmann returned to Europe, where he taught as an assistant at the ETH in Zurich, Switzerland. From 1961 to 1974, he was an associate professor at Cornell, and from 1974 to 1976, he was teaching at Harvard University. He was always in high demand as a lecturer and guest critic. He was one of the most astute and demanding critics that I have ever encountered. Throughout most of his teaching career, he also maintained an active practice. And for those of us who teach full-time, know how difficult it is to do that. His firm, Werner Seligmann Associates, was launched in 1961. The firm won 2 Progressive Architecture Design Awards. His firm appeared on the cover of Progressive Architecture 3 times and placed or won in numerous international and national competitions. Seligmann's innovative work on developing housing prototypes established his reputation in the area of housing, and his project for Beth David Synagogue in Binghamton, New York, just down the road, is regarded as a significant synthesis of the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier. Throughout his active career, Seligmann also published numerous articles on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, on Le Corbusier, and on modern architecture in general. In 1998, he was awarded the Topaz Medallion in architectural education, jointly from the ACSA and the AIA. This is their highest award that is given to an educator in architecture. In 1981, Seligmann was named a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and in 1994, he was designated the Thomas Jefferson Visiting Professor at the University of Virginia. Over the years, he held many distinguished appointments in the U.S. and abroad, including the ETH in Zurich, Kanto Gakuin University in Japan, Yale University, Harvard University, and others. So it is with this annual lecture that we honor his memory and the extraordinary contribution that he made to architectural education and practice in general, and to Syracuse University in particular. Thus, it is fitting that the Seligmann lecturers are selected on the basis of their contribution to architectural education and practice. Well, it is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Marlon Blackwell is a longtime friend of Syracuse architecture as well as an alumnus of our master's program in Florence. Marlon and I taught alongside of one another in the second-year studios in the early 1990s. I recall that a number of us were very sorry when he decided to move on. It has been a while since Marlon has been back in Slocum, and I am very pleased that he has taken time from his busy practice and his teaching to be here tonight. And I must say that I'm very pleased that he managed to avoid that storm, and he took the Charlotte route instead of Cleveland, so that was good that he did that. In practice since 1990 as Marlon Blackwell Architects, Marlon's exceptional portfolio of work lies outside the mainstream and is characterized by design strategies that draw upon vernaculars, typologies, and contradictions of place, strategies that seek to transgress conventional boundaries of architecture. His work has received numerous national and international design awards and has been published in numerous books, journals, and magazines. In 2005, Princeton Architectural Press published a monograph of his work entitled An Architecture of the Ozarks, the works of Marlon Blackwell. In 2006, Marlon was selected by the International Design magazine as one of the ID 40 undersung heroes, and in 1998 by the Architectural League of New York as an emerging voice. The Office of Marlon Blackwell Architects was recognized as the Firm of the Year by Residential Architecture magazine in 2011. Other recent national awards include a 2012 AIA National Honor Award for the IMA Ruth Lilly Visitors Pavilion in Indianapolis, Indiana, and a 2013 AIA National Honor Award for the St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Church in Springdale, Arkansas. That church, by the way, also received the Best Civic and Community Building Award at the 2011 World Architecture Festival in Barcelona, Spain. Marlon's enduring contributions to the field are significant, as evidenced by being selected for the 2012 Architecture Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2014 being named a United States Arts Ford Fellow. He is currently serving as a distinguished professor in the Fay Jones School of Architecture at the University of Arkansas, where in his spare time he is also head of the department. I don't know how you do that, Marlon. I don't know how you do that. He has been a distinguished visiting professor at a number of institutions, including the University of Michigan, the University of Florida, Auburn University, Middlebury College, Washington University in St. Louis, and MIT in Cambridge. Most recently, Marlon served as the George Baird Professor at Cornell University. And for his work at the University of Arkansas, Marlon was named as one of Design Intelligence magazine's 30 most admired educators in 2015. Congratulations on that, Marlon. Please join me in welcoming the 2015 Seligmann Lecturer, Marlon Blackwell.
Well, thank you, Randall, and nice to be back after 23 years. It's nice to see that the changes here have been relatively modest, in some ways and good. I love the interventions that have been made in the building. I remember trudging up 5 floors to get to my studio back in the day, heaving and breathing hard and scaring the hell out of my students in the process. I thought I was going to die. But great to be back. I wanted to come back in January because I remember Syracuse as cold and snowy and really tough. And I said, you know, that's going to jar the memories. And I came back, and I think I slipped on the ice as soon as I stepped out of the plane. It was great. And I couldn't think of a better time of year to be here. It's right in the thick of things. I have spent the last 23 years in Northwest Arkansas, which is the home of the Ozarks, the capital of Walmart, and a host of other places and corporations that you may or may not like Tyson Chicken and J.B. Hunt and all of that. It's where I live, build, work, and practice mostly. I wanted to give you a little bit of just a background, just sort of get started, because so much of what you do is shaped by where you've been and who you've met and your experiences along the way. And I was born in Germany. I grew up in a military family, moving around quite a bit. My family is from the South, from Alabama. I love to draw. I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I found out that a lot of cartoonists have alcohol problems, so I decided I'd be an architect. They have a lot of alcohol problems too, that I noticed also, so I don't know about that. But I love nature, and I really I feared it as well. In high school, I was a wrestler, and a pretty good one. I did wrestle a bear once. It's a long story. I don't have time to tell it to you tonight. I'll cut to the chase. He kicked my ass, but it was quite an experience. I went to Auburn University as an undergrad without ever having read a book on architecture. Really didn't know what the heck I was doing. And I came from a very modest background. The only way I could go to college was to put my way through it. So I took a job as a Bible salesman in the rural South for 5 summers, each summer getting enough money to get through the next year. And I did really well at that, and then at one of our awards banquets, this guy shows up here on the left to kind of present the awards. It was shocking to him, I'm sure, in my puka shells and knick-knack shirt. Anybody can survive the 70s fashion. I'm living proof of that, although I find it's making its way back around now. My students call me Dirk Diggler for whatever reason. But anyways, so it was an amazing job, though. I mean, this selling Bibles in the rural South, because I was in places that most folks only read about, and I got a firsthand experience of the culture, of the people, of the land, and the power of great storytelling that takes place in the South, and it really helped shape me in many ways. And you know, I've always thought of myself, at least politically, as somewhat of an independent. So it's been a kind of a burden to go for nearly 30 years with my only photograph of a politician and myself as a Republican. So I thought I need balance in my life. So last year, I met this guy, and you know, I explained to him my dilemma, and he says, "Oh, I can help you out with that." And so that's how I got the photograph, and so now my life is in balance, and maybe, hopefully, everything's not downhill from here. But certainly, we like to call where I'm from in Arkansas the land of Bill and a billion chickens, largest producer of chickens in the world. But what I love about the chickens are the chicken houses. And these are these wonderful structures that are about 30, 40 feet wide, 200 to 600 feet long in the landscape. They glow at night. There's like homage to Dan Flavin, the landscape in the evenings. But what I like about them is that whenever you see one, you pretty much know where you are in the landscape, because they're most always oriented east-west. Because the chicken farmers figured out pretty quickly that if you minimize the sun exposure on the east and the west, control the sun on the south, the chickens wouldn't cook before their time. And I like that kind of common sense, and that sort of approach is really what informs how we approach architecture, just in a sort of straightforward manner. When Princeton approached us about, doing a monograph, which I thought was way too early, in fact I like to call it a monograph, the early work, they really wanted an iconic image of our place. And for us, the Ozarks, I've always thought about it as the intersection of hills and valleys. Fayetteville, Arkansas, where I live, is the only town in the Ozarks built on hills. So you can be in the middle of downtown and look out and actually see pastures and chicken houses and all that good stuff. So that whole intersection. And the highest hill in Fayetteville is the University of Arkansas. You can see this is Old Main here, our oldest building on the campus. So we found this great position in the valley with this cow and our new calf, and education, our culture and agriculture coming together, defining the Ozarks, the intersection. And just as we went to take the photograph, a Walmart truck drives right through the middle of it. And I completely forgot, as a center of commerce as well. And all of these things, it's like a great roux, forms a great roux, a mixing pot from which we work within. And it's a place of real natural beauty, and simultaneously a place of real constructed ugliness. And words like abandonment, erasure, nostalgia, exploitation, they're all aspects of this place. And they're no more real than each other. They're conditions that are as authentic as the natural beauty and the local form. And this is a land of disparate conditions that isn't just a setting for our work, but has really become part of our work. And in these conditions, I don't see a negative. What I try to see is a source of deep possibilities in direct experience with the world by choosing to stay and work here in what we like to call the Ozark Outback. What we've been able to do is turn over the rock and discover the underbelly of our place. Its visceral presences and expressive character that really sustains our efforts there. And what I'm doing is working from a very simple conviction that architecture is larger than the subject of architecture. And so what we try to do is look at the world with a wide-angle, microscopic lens to try to generate ideas and actions from our concrete experiences with the everyday, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between one's own personal history and the history of our discipline. I wonder if there's any way to turn down the lights a little bit. Is that possible? Just to get a little bit more, is that, we have a technical guy here, right?
No, I'm not that technical.
No, but he said he would be around. Yeah, no, is that okay? Do you normally do that? Yeah, I'm feeling like we're missing something here. Oh, no, I mean really crack it down, and, like mood lighting, you know?
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Or is that
that's
too
good.
dark?
No, that's good. Isn't that better?
You need to read your notes?
No, that's all right. I'm good. I'm good. I get to a certain point and I just wing it. So talking about working between one's own personal history and the history of the discipline, most of you may or may not recognize this building to the left, but this is the masterwork of E. Jones, the Thorn Crown Chapel, which is in Eureka Springs, not far from where I live. I think, was voted by the AIA as the fourth best building built in the U.S. in the 20th century. And it's really architecture at the highest level. We've taken everybody here, everybody from Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, to Zumthor, to Libeskind, Eisenman, all of these folks have been here, and they all respond in a very, I think, affirmative and a visceral way when they experience it. And so it's just one of those great icons where I live. Now, another great icon where I live is just across town from the church here, which is, they call the Passion Plays, where folks come to see actors act out the life of Christ. Tourists come from all over the country to see this. And they had built this and designed first this really large statue of Christ. And he was supposed to be really tall, much taller than he is here. But he was going to have to be so tall that he was going to be in the FAA kind of flight path, so he was having to wear a flashing blue light on his head. And they didn't want that, so rather than redesign him, they just cut him off at the knees and pushed him in the ground. And so he's got the proportions of a milk carton, so he's known as Milk Carton Jesus where we live. So I'm just showing this just to illustrate the conditions of the high and low of culture that we operate in. And again, we don't see that as a negative. In fact, we don't try to resolve one to the other. What we're really after is a condition of resonance working between these conditions through the things that we make. And so this requires us to be very attentive observers of the world around us, often right beneath our feet, of both, like geological and biological conditions, and always cultural. And what it's allowed us to do is form a bottom-up process, an inductive process that allows us to amplify the small things that manifest the large things. So in this line of thinking, we can say, after the great poet William Carlos Williams, that there are no ideas but in things. And I think as contemporary architects, this allows us to engage some very critical questions. One is, how do we embrace the world without being consumed by it? And secondly, how do we enrich and dignify the experience of being in the world through the things that we make? I think Da Vinci spoke very directly about working from the experience of things when he said it should not be so hard for you to stop sometimes and look into the ashes of a fire or clouds or mud or like places in which you may find really marvelous ideas. So all we're trying to do is, out of the muck of our own condition, is to find some really marvelous ideas. I think it's safe to say that most architecture isn't very good, and most good architecture is good enough for most days. But there is some architecture, some buildings that need to rise above the everyday, and I think this necessarily challenges us to return to the significance of the everyday and to revalidate it through the things that we make. So what we've been doing very much is choosing to work between the motivating forces of the everyday, where the inadvertent meets the purposeful. And we've developed this set of operations that really assist us in this task of recreating strangeness, to represent the world as we find it, or at least I should say the world as it's given to us, into the world as we find it. So simple things like you see here, of finding forms in the world, and then just by representing them, we can reprogram them. We can begin to introduce something that is at once connected to its place, but also part of a universal language or a larger kind of global discourse. And so it's a productive tension between the local and universal, and that's very much what we're after. And always looking for analogous relationships between what is nature-made and what is man-made as a source of ideas and possibilities. Very early on, in fact, I think even as I was a professor here, was developing a series of prototypes. I didn't have much work at all, just out of grad school. The opportunity to teach at Syracuse provided me with some time to really think about how we build in the landscape, how we might begin to think analogously about things that are more inanimate or say industrial or pre-industrial even, and things that are more organic, and really begin to mix and hybridize certain typologies to develop a kind of new way of occupying the landscape. And these were a series of prototypes that I called roadside villas for the new American landscape. And they very much formed a bucket of ideas for me to draw from in terms of developing a formal language as well as certain material logics and forms of expression that might go with it in preparation in my own mind for those works to come. And this is the Dragonfly House that came out of it's a form of architectural husbandry, I guess, that which had emerged out of that. And after 20 years now with the firm, we've sort of started to look back a little bit and look at the evolutionary typologies that have emerged here, with the idea that typologies are in fact evolutionary. They are in fact dynamic and adaptive. They are not fixed. I think when they become fixed, then that's when it's the new urbanists kind of step up to the plate, because it really becomes more about style. And what I'm interested in is how things adapt in the face of environmental or social change, or technical change, even for that matter. So we're looking at certain progenitors here, the shotgun house, the villa, these sorts of things, and then other sort of organic systems that aren't architecture but have an architecture, and how they began to influence the work on how the ideas embedded in these early projects began to develop progeny, you might say. Ideas, like I say, most people only have a couple ideas anyway, and you rub them together like two sticks, and different types of fire come out of that. And so this is just an ongoing project, but it's a kind of nice way for us to begin to understand this sort of family tree that's emerging from our body of work. Always thinking about that relationship between the ideal in our discipline and the more improvised in our discipline, and realizing that in some ways they're not so far apart, and how we might work between. So that line of thinking has led us to a variety of small projects, early projects that are now really informing the latter projects. This is a small honey house for a beekeeper in North Carolina. A woman I had done her house 10 years earlier, former girlfriend's mother. So just for the students there, if you know the relationship goes sour, you get dumped, you get asked to be a friend, just to consider the possibilities. Don't reject that. So I got to do her house, and then later had to do this small honey house. And it's a simple structure, $40,000 structure, but it was a test for me to kind of see if architecture could happen at any scale. And so we just really looked at one primary element, a beautiful wall that was load-bearing, made of quarter-inch steel plate and faceted glass, that could act as a brise-soleil in the display, and act as a place to display and store the honey. And it really came out of looking at this relationship, this sort of rationalized process between the beekeeper and the bee that's evolved over centuries. And I was particularly taken by the frames where the brood chambers happen in the bottom of this diagram of a bee box, where the eggs are laid by the queen, and then the other chambers up above, the frames where the food is stored, and then the way you neutralize bees with smoking, you remove the top of the lid, and you can remove the honey without disturbing the brood chamber. It's clearly a wonderful kind of system of logics. And these Cartesian frames delimit the activities of the bee, but they don't really change the way the bee is genetically programmed to behave. So I love these sort of contrasting systems working together, which help us in many ways begin to think about how this wall might evolve as a deep surface, as a very systemic kind of structure. This is, like I say, a load-bearing wall, made primarily of voids, but then acts as for storage and display of the honey itself. And in fact, in developing in these deep surfaces also allowed for the forces of nature to imprint itself upon it. So we have small animals and insects and stuff that are in these voids that actually nest there. Another project that, more bring it back to Arkansas a little bit, we had the opportunity to do was a 7-story tower house in Fayetteville, right in the city limits. And once again here, drawing upon the local vernacular, or what one might say is more of a pre-industrial or industrial vernacular, even emerging, and then drawing from my own experience of travel in Italy and places like Yemen, where culturally the idea of living in towers is quite suitable to the terrain and to the way in which society is organized. In this particular case, we're very interested in how this tower met the ground, so we took an inventory of the site, looking at the patterns and textures provided to us by nature, especially the striated bark of the white oak and the hickory, and then using that, developing a locally milled white oak fin lattice that surrounds the 50-foot high courtyard and stairway, and establishes, it kind of acts as a datum to the mature height of the oak trees that surround it. And then above that are a series of buildings sprinkled throughout northwest Arkansas that are industrial and agricultural, all white, in white metal or white concrete. Really another order in the landscape once you get above the canopy. So we developed a system of articulation using metal panels, very taut, very thin, that slips over the wood and then creates the expressive character for the tower itself, which all leads us to the primary aspects of the program. The top, which is really a place for view and the act of viewing. It's a 360-degree viewing space, which is the living room as well as the sleeping area. It's a room that's Miesian in conception, in the sense that the distance from your eye to the ceiling and your eye to the floor is essentially equal. And so there's a kind of heightened perception of the horizon as it extends beyond. If you flip the room upside down, you have essentially the same spatial experience. Out of the ceiling comes a stair, and you move up into a sky court, which is a room open to the sky with controlled views to the landscape. And so there's a wonderful kind of tension between these two ways of living up above the trees. And then moving forward into another type, which is the traditional American golf clubhouse. We were, jumping from these smaller projects and had the opportunity to do a more public project, even though it was a private clubhouse. Certainly sat right on the road of a public highway. And the owner had asked us to kind of come at it very differently. He said, I don't want another Terra, another one of these clubs that looks like a plantation home or a hunting lodge. I want something that looks like it came from our place and is part of the 21st century. So we developed a very sort of kind of simple footprint, a copper box sitting on locally cored dry stack stone, comes from Paris, Arkansas, and timeless materials of stone and copper, but yet preserving the traditional rituals of the game itself. My first response to him when he approached us about this was like, man, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know anything about golf. And his response was, well, Marlon, it's really not about golf, is it? Isn't it really about people and space? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. So, you get educated by your clients quite often. So, and then taking that material logic of the copper and the stone and the local idea of local sourcing, bringing it on into the lobby and allowing that to begin to articulate the spaces. So beginning to learn how to develop a kind of strategies for interiority, which we really hadn't had much of in these sort of outbuildings we had been working on. This is all computer slip match, local cherry, plywoods, almost seamless in the way in which they're put together. A wonderful kind of locally sourced Zen garden, the dining room area out to the valley. Moving up the steps, the skylit grand stairs, into the upstairs lounge with its open locker area and lounge, There's a couple of very critical elements, fireplace, media wall, bar, critical elements, of course, in any club. Nice view, again, acting as a type of threshold out into the landscape. And then providing some surprises you wouldn't expect in a golf clubhouse in the wet areas. I had somebody on a blog said Peter Zumthor called and wants his thermal baths back. And I was so thankful to see the next line that said, yeah, and the Romans called Peter would like theirs back as well. So, it was nice to be part of some sort of lineage there. So again, taking typologies, beginning to ask the question, how might it be otherwise? This really came to bear in post-Katrina, working with Architecture for Humanity. May they rest in peace. I heard they closed down 2 weeks ago. But they had come in and were sponsoring, along with Oprah Winfrey and Autodesk, great combination, a model home program that would really take seriously the new FEMA regulations. Biloxi was the only town in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi that rejected the new urbanist plan. They decided that not everybody wants to live in grandma's house with a geranium on the porch. That, in fact, you could take seriously these new shifting landscapes and criteria where every new structure in the city limits has to be built 6 to 11 feet above the ground to resist Category 4 storm surges and wind. And so the implications of that for the urban fabric are quite large. To do that creates a lot of residual conditions at the ground level, kind of interrupts in many ways the social fabric as well. So what to do? So our prototype, which was selected by a single man and his 3 children, he had some property there, really was born out of an existing type already, the shotgun, where the porch really is that social interface between the private world of the house and the more public world of the street, and a very important component to the fabric, especially in the South. So our idea was to keep that porch intact on the ground level, elevate the program, and then stack the program to get a more concise footprint, minimizing the residual space, just using what you need at the ground level. And that evolved into what we call the porch dog, which was then built for about $130 a square foot. These are prototypes that can be repeated, very unlike the Make It Right program, which are essentially a series of unicorns built for an exorbitant amount of costs, and then subsidized for mortgages. That you can't repeat those; they're just too expensive. So this is a 1,500 plus square foot house, and just some very simple strategies, which is making this metal box container, strategies of perforating the stairs that come from the outside to the inside, so as the water rises, it pushes through the stairs rather than creating pressure that might blow the doors open inside. Letting the folks, Richard and his family, just decorate it as they please, and I think it's better than most of the stuff we do. And then thinking about what it is to go through a storm like this. So many people died in Katrina because they didn't want to leave, because they didn't want to risk losing everything they had to looting and that sort of thing if they did leave. So in this case, we use slidable or sliding perforated screens that can be open and closed for control of the sun, but they also can be locked in place. And this is on all sides. So you can lock the place and leave before a storm hits and feel secure that things inside are indeed secure. So again, the idea, and I want to have to point this out, that is a Katrina cottage the new urbanists came up with. So in the next Category 4 storm, I know which one will still be there. Right? So this idea of the porch as something, as a liminal zone in which we can begin to sort of generate an architecture from, really have started looking at very carefully. We're working now with James Corner's office, field operations, on the largest urban park in the country in Memphis, Tennessee. It's a 4,500-acre urban park, Shelby Farms. They've been working on it for quite a while. We were brought in where they're expanding a lake to develop 7 buildings around the lake, a visitor center, a restaurant retreat center, boat kiosk, stage events, an ensemble of buildings that would have kind of language that would be related to each other. And we kind of came from these old farm shed type buildings, or again, the old dog trots that you might find, or porch, small porch vernacular, and then been expanding that so you're beginning to negotiate that residential and that industrial scale. This is the visitor center. It's all made out of bar grate. It's got about a 40-foot cantilever. It's an 8,000 square foot building with an 8,000 square foot porch, which is very important, faces towards the south. And that porch is ventilated by 5 20-foot big-ass fans. So the thing here is that you can be in the shade in Memphis and it's very humid and you can sweat a lot. So these fans help create a cooling effect that allows you to take full advantage of being in the shade. Another small project nearby on the lakeside, which is a small pavilion for about events of about 3,000. This is the lakeside part, and then here, the stage where that can happen. It's in a very simple palette of materials, a zinc-like metal panels with second growth cypress wood makes up all the buildings, except for the visitor center, which is pretty much all bar grate, has more of a jellyfish look. This is the boathouse here with its metal grate box filled with canoes and kayaks. Picnic tables, or picnic pavilions we call the crickets. And then the restaurant retreat center, which is again made of locally quarried stone, bar grate, and the metal panels. But each building comes with its own sort of porch. This is the restaurant retreat center along the lake, and again working with the coroner's office to develop a transept up from the lake through the walk into the building itself. And again, learning very much how to work from where we already are in the local culture and its sort of heritage, but also beginning to speculate further in a very much more reductive way. These are start construction in March, and pretty excited about it. It's been a long process, but we think will act as a nice ensemble and complement to the landscape that's emerging through Coroner's efforts there. Continuing with that, we just finished a Montessori school, elementary school recently, in a flood zone. We had to do it for $185 a square foot. It's an 8,000 square foot elementary school. The owner had 7 students. She wanted to grow. She had really poor facilities, although she did well at the younger year levels. Once you got up into elementary, she found it very difficult to compete with other schools. So we developed a strategy that came out of trying to understand this piece of property that sits in the floodplain, where all the limitations of floodways, flood zones, easements allowed only a triangular piece of land to be built in. And so we try to resolve everything with a box. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of the dumb box. So all geometries can be resolved with a box, trust me. So the triangle, we figured out we could make 2 boxes, and we kind of make a V, and nice rain garden here, green roof, kind of mitigating water runoff. Simple palette, second growth cypress, box rib metal system that we use and hybridize all the transitions at the EUs and the corners to give it a certain level of seamlessness. The inside's really tough concrete, drywall, specific elements that are kind of articulated just a little bit more, bring some oomph. Get to rub a buffalo hide as you go in. Then up top, just very simple, nicely daylit spaces for learning experience like they do in the Montessori. And our greatest sense of achievement with this project was resolving this corner, going from 60 degrees to 90 degrees with one piece of trim. We're all BIM in the office, so we knew this was coming up, so we spent a long time modeling this strange-looking piece of trim that would visually work from 60 degrees to 90 degrees. Put it in the drawings, dimension it, everything. The contractor still had to rebuild it 3 times because they couldn't get their head around it. But we finally got it, and it's just all carefully coursed and seamless. And once this was nailed, it was Miller time. It was really, in a small project like this, you have to look for the small victories, and this is what moves us away from the diagram and really gets into the realm of architecture, I think. In Indianapolis, as Randall mentioned, we had a significant project, our first national project, which is completed in 2010, was for an art and nature park, a 100-acre art and nature park for the Indianapolis Museum of Art. This project really was seen as more as an extension of a series of pathway journeys, not necessarily a destination in itself. And we really had to struggle with the site, which is a very volatile site in the oxbow of a white river that runs right through the middle of Indianapolis, and we're right at the edge of downtown into the more suburban areas here. This is the Museum of Art and a canal that also runs through Indianapolis. So it's essentially a peninsula, an island almost. In the middle of this oxbow used to be the forest, and then it became a pasture, and then it was excavated into a quarry for limestone to build an interstate through the middle of Indianapolis. That filled up with water and became a lake and an amenity in the city. So we had to deal with that. Now, because of indiscriminate development upriver, this particular area has had 3 100-year floods in the last 6 years. So the river rises higher than the lake and then breaches and scours the entire site except for just a couple of places. We start with 100 acres. When you factor in all the flood zones, the floodways and such, we only had 0.67 acres to build on. So finding the site wasn't that difficult, actually. But really, there was only a place here and here in the woodlands and a little triangular piece of land. These are some of the many aspects of the park, the pathway journeys, bridges, and site-specific artwork by Team A out of Brooklyn. Our site was wet and fecund as we found it, and then we show it underwater. The challenge we had was we have to raise it up 5 feet out of the forest floor, right at eye level, with little columns, which is not so desirable. And so we're sitting there kind of scratching our heads like, how do we negotiate this? We've been working very diligently with Mary Miss, who's an environmental artist from New York, and Ed Blake from Mississippi, our landscape architect. And he devised a very clever set of figured mounds that rise about 3.5 feet out of the forest floor in an almost like you would see an Indian mound, just beautiful green covered mounds that point to particular places in the landscape with these pointed figures. And then our structure would straddle this, floating just above it, and the ADA ramps that we have would extend beyond the building and connect with the pathway journeys, and thus seamlessly integrating it to this artificial landscape and the more natural one around us. And this is it here. So it's just very, very subtle. You really just kind of come upon it in the woods, and then you discover what it has to give once you get underneath it. Now, we're looking very carefully at analogies again, looking at the microscopic images of butterfly wings, or at these leaves eaten away by insects that I kept finding on the site and pressing in my sketchbook. I loved the way in which the structure was intact, but there was a great deal of lightness and porosity in the surface of the leaves, not unlike the canopy of the trees. And so I began to think about a building that could allow light and air to move through it, but would be really strong. And the idea was to use one material, one detail for the most part. The floor would be the material, the detail. It would fold up, the vertical wall, and fold over the same structure and material. So in a sense, an exoskeleton, and the only thing you come in contact with is the wood members. So this is an animation that we did to show you conceptually how it works. Students take notes because it's just not as difficult as we tend to make it out as professors sometimes. Okay, thanks. If you missed it, there it is, all folded out. And it's like a big tortilla, and the lounge and everything is, a program is sandwiched between, and this is the project. And then understanding the system that we have made, the system of articulation with the 2x4 Ipe, with the exoskeleton, we could begin to pleat that system to create a variety of oculi that penetrate add for intensification of water and snow and light. And I worked with a really great structural engineer, Guy Nordenson, in New York, and a great collaborator. And the goal was to make an exoskeleton that really isn't perceived except through its shadow, not so much visibly. And shadow that's constantly moving because of the way light and the clouds move throughout the day. So it really pulsates with the rhythm of the day. Now that's something I really wish I had a video of. And to get past all the codes and everything, for the floor, the deck, we basically infilled between very carefully to allow light and water to go through it, but 1x2 acrylic bars that are UV rated were screwed into each piece of wood to make a composite beam, and then we can light that from below at night. So it really begins to act as this type of apparition in the woods. And then everything sort of comes together in this vitrine of a lounge, and then the solid box of burned cedar, which is in fact the services for the building, bathrooms, kitchen for the park, and then that all comes together in an interior of water-popped, ebonized white oak that's polished, and it kind of has a fixed finish, but then it's contrasted with this ipe wood that will turn silver over time. So again, these contrasts of different durations of material and finishes are kind of brought to bear here. And then set off into its place, both the kind of weathering wrapper and then the more inert box. And then kind of different times of the seasons and year that it begins to take on different character. And finally, the killer shot. You got to have that. At least my photographer says I do. This was the first, I think, national AIA winner for the city of Indianapolis in its history. So it's a kind of loved building and has been a real success in the park. More recently, we were invited to do our first real serious interiors space. This is for a museum in, I don't know if you've heard about it, in Bentonville, Arkansas, called Crystal Bridges, designed by Moshe Safdie. The patron is Alice Walton, the Harris of Walmart. She has one of the most amazing collections of American art. This is the most significant American art museum built in the country since the Whitney. And it was well under construction when we were invited in to do the museum store, which is a relatively small space, about 3,000 square feet in the midst of all this museum. But it was conceived, at least by the owners of the museum, as a retail space that would be an extension of the museum experience. And this is Crystal Bridges here. It sits along and crosses over a creek. It's a series of, I'd say, geometric and organic type forms. And you can kind of see that from above. Here, you enter into a courtyard in this orange area, this curved white space is where we were asked to do the museum store, the downtown square of Bentonville, and this sort of cultural destination now in the region of Crystal Bridges. So this is what we were presented with, an empty white box, lots of columns holding up a green roof above, west-facing glass, which is really a problem. Not the ideal place for a retail store. But we were thinking more about the material culture where we're at, the great hardwood forest we have in the Ozarks, and how we might repurpose that in some ways to refine that into simple elements that could be repeated, simple units, not unlike what we had experienced in Fay Jones Chapel, kind of economy of means, because we were very limited in the budget that we were working within. So what we did was develop a carapace, a hanging carapace in a way, that reconfigured the interior of the store to various sort of scales, began to practically cover the ducts and the sprinklers and all of that, control the lighting, and allow merchandise to be embedded in it. And this is all made out of 285 cherry ribs that are CNC milled directly from our BIM files. A local mill worker had just a regular 3-axis CNC. So it was the first project we've been able to totally digitally fabricate, including all of the furniture, the gondolas and the display vitrines. And this was all born out of really kind of looking at local artists that were going to be featured in here. We sort of saw the artifacts that were going in here before we actually really got working in the space as part of the research. And we met this fellow, Leon Niehaus, who's a very famous basket maker from Huntsville, Arkansas. And we went to his studio, and it was quite an experience to see some of his private studio in the woods. And we discovered he drew every basket in profile with charcoal on a newsprint pad. And then he would take that profile and extrude it along a path. And then as it kind of closed in on itself, he would create some kind of identity or flourish that gave it its identity, some kind of operation that he would make. And so the operation of just profile extruded along a path really began to get us to think of this place as more of a container, a vessel. So my early sketches were really about trying to find the right profile that could knock down 40% of the sun, to begin to obscure all the infrastructure from hanging from the ceilings, and to embed merchandise in it. And then that eventually evolved into these 285 ribs made from 465 sheets of plywood that were optimized to minimize waste, even milling in the connections. Each one different, they're all custom, and then fabricating that, and then of course the reality of it all coming together. There's Andy working on his CNC. This guy makes newel posts for a living, pretty much, and so this is a great challenge for him. He's milling in the connections, and then the array of all the different profiles. And the reason it had to be all custom was that we weren't working from a radial point. We were working in parallel lines against the curve in order to control the space between the ribs itself. And then each one of these ribs might have several components to it. And it was put up almost by two old guys who just took 3 weeks to kind of put it together one piece at a time. They likened it to laying stone in the air. Did a wonderful job. When they were done, though, they asked us to lose their phone number. Didn't bother them anymore. So, and you know, as you probably have been told by your professors here, that if you want to be a really good architect, you have to be really good at post-rationalization. You know, one of the guys in the office said, "Hey, this looks like the underside of a mushroom." I said, "Yeah, it does." And so we call it the lamella. We did a few diagrams to kind of play around with that as well. But post-rationalization is key to your success. Well, we love the way the light begins to bounce around and just baffle through in the afternoons. Again, understanding this thing again as a system, and then all the different sort of pieces that go with that system, both in the kind of container part, but so these gondolas and latrines that float with the large cash wrap that acts as the nerve center, and then all the inventory is embedded in these containers. So everything, all of these are drawers and cabinets that you put your inventory in. And what the owner loved most about this was that this store paid for itself in 4 months with the profits that it made, and it gave us the opportunity to demonstrate to quite a big patron of the arts that good design can be good business, and that has certainly developed into a lot more work with this particular family. Now, as I said, most of us only have a couple of ideas, so we thought we had an opportunity at the Smithsonian Gallery, the Renwick Gallery, Smithsonian Institute, to transform the Grand Salon. This was an invited competition. We were down to the final 5, quite excited about it, and we wanted to take some of what we learned from this experience and reapply it in some ways. And the Renwick Gallery really is the decorative arts component of the Smithsonian. And it's in this building here, which is right near the White House. This is the Grand Salon as it exists. And a variety of artifacts. We knew we would find, you know, paintings and things like this on the inside, but we didn't expect to find all of this new artifacts and new technologies that were happening as well. So it's very current in its collection. What they were wanting to do is to transform this space into an architectural destination that could be used for a variety of programs like fashion shows, films, art shows, and that it would last for 5 years and then be taken down. You couldn't really disturb the shape of the room. And we began to think about D.C., Washington, D.C., and how it originated, and being a forest, being in effect parts of it a swamp. And we thought maybe this is an opportunity to bring the forest back to the city, to come back to origins. And so we knew of a swamp 100 miles away, the Pocomoke swamp, right near Delaware, where you could harvest in a limited amount cypress trees. And we began to think that perhaps the way we would do this is to calculate how much veneer cypress we could get out of a certain amount of logs that would completely reskin the building and develop a way of lighting it and creating a canopy that it didn't have before. So there were about 465 lanterns that we developed, 6 foot high by 2 feet. We calculated, I think there were about 54 logs, including the floor, the lumber floor, and end walls, and then thin backlit veneer that would glow both at the canopy and at the sidewalls of this space. And then again, working with Guy with an aluminum rib system that would act as the interface between the existing wall and the new epidermis. And then very mindful of the classical proportions as we develop these units and the multiple of these units in their organization. And so this is the space, and then once this is all inserted, it's made up again of all the bells, all the backlit veneer. But the trick to this is that all of these individual lanterns are on motion detectors and the actuators. And so when people come in, they actually shift and move, and can actually you can override them and program them for specific types of events. For acoustics, there are inserts that you put into it, or lighting. So very dynamic space that would be kind of in some ways self-organizing, and in other ways could be programmed to reconfigure itself. And this happens just very simple, taking a solar array on the roof, and that would supply the power to do this, and they kind of use the excess power to sell off. This is the armature here, which with all the actuators and the backlighting. There is no lighting in the lanterns. It's always between the lanterns, and then understanding the limits of movement in the space. And then working with Richard Renfro, a really great lighting designer out of New York, who happens to be from Arkansas, and how we develop a strategy for getting the wood to glow and being able to control that. And then these are some of the different, just the different kinds of programs that could take place, and the different configurations. And then after 5 years, all of this could be recycled, all of the wood, either as an artifact itself or just in another configuration. We didn't win, so it's hugely disappointing. And what I've learned is when you don't win, when the project doesn't happen, it really becomes an investment in your spiritual savings bank, only to be reused maybe perhaps later down the road. But we learned a lot from the experience. The folks that actually won weren't even architects. They were Disney Imagineers. We had the brilliant idea of shooting images on the walls. So the ceiling could be the sky, and the walls could be the streets. Anyways, it's tough for all the architects that didn't, thought otherwise. So this idea of repurposing that I keep bringing up, it was really brought to bear. I was looking at some Getty images recently that are from Arkansas. Senator William J. Fulbright, I'm sure you've heard of, who's from Fayetteville, Arkansas, was from Fayetteville, Arkansas, Fulbright scholarships. His family owned a mill, and they made farm implements, plowshares, wagon wheels, all sorts of things like that. And another person from Fayetteville, Arkansas, who was building a fine arts complex on the University of Arkansas's campus, Edward Durrell Stone, was a friend. They were friends. And Mr. Fulbright was telling how the the need for what they were making from the mill was really diminishing post-war. And Mr. Stone had an idea that, hey, why could we take these plowshares and handles and wagon wheels and convert them, repurpose them into an international line of furniture that I could put in my fine arts complex and we could market. And so that's exactly what they did. So these plow handles become chairs, wagon wheels become stools, and the great basket making crafts of the Ozarks, thin strips of white oak are used to make chase lounges on the plowshares. And really this notion of the sustainable is quite old, right? And rather than worry about whether we have bamboo floors or not, or whatever we're using, or paper stone or whatever, I think the thing that we often need to concern ourselves with is what we already have. Saying goes, we don't want to get anywhere, we just want to get to where we already are. There's so much existing fabric that we can repurpose that I think is something we really have to be attentive to. And about nearly half of the projects we do are adaptive reuse and forms of preservation. For example, a project in Gentry, Arkansas, relatively poor town near about 45 minutes from Fayetteville, town of 2,500 people. They have one industry, a Little Debbie snack food plant. If you like oatmeal cakes, it's the place to go. They have a zoo, an outdoor wild country safari, so you drive through the landscape and monkeys and ostriches chase your car. And that's it. But they really wanted a public library. And they had one, except it was privately funded. And it was located in this little building right here. And they had the dream of having a much larger public library, a community room, a place for their genealogy department, a place to display historical artifacts from the city's history. And they wanted to be on Main Street. And so they came into the ownership of an old hardware store, 100-year-old hardware store. And this is how we found it. And it had been hit by storms. It essentially a ruin, all the windows blown out for the most part. And when the storms hit, it's in Tornado Alley, they would blow the bricks off. It blew the corbel parapet off. They'd blow the bricks off. They just put it up with whatever they had. So we were asked to turn this into a library. My first reaction was, let's tear it down, start from the beginning, be lots cheaper, and of course, as an architect, we can do what we want. But the library board president's like, no, that's a terrible idea. This has got a lot of sentimental attachment from our citizens. It's been the socio-economic hub of our city for nearly 100 years. And the mayor piped in and said, yeah, I used to eat barbecued beaver out of the bottom floor there when I was a kid. We'll eat anything in Arkansas pretty much, but nonetheless, you could tell that there was sentiment. So how to keep the building, not create a false history or pastiche, but give it a new identity. So we began to look at it as an artifact in and of itself. And we over a period of time, this sounds easy, but it wasn't. It was like piles and piles of trace paper up to your neck, trying to figure out what to do. And finally came to the conclusion that perhaps rather than change the form or anything, we just change the syntax, the doors, the windows, columns, things of that nature, and create a new set of elements for it. So these are little soap bubble windows that actually slip over the blown out window. So we just leave it as a ruin for the most part. I'm thinking about Franco Albini here and being in Genoa and seeing some of the great things that he did. So this came right directly out of my experience as a student in the Syracuse and Florence grad program. But I thought that would be the way we could do it, is give this project a new language. And so this is it today. And we had to do this for $110 a square foot. It took 7 years to build, to get it through all the processes and the rebidding it time and again and dealing with all the small town politics. It's a tough town. This is the mayor right here. And he owns a tattoo parlor. So the small town politics there are pretty tough, but he was one of the best politicians I'd ever met and helped guide us through this to come out on the top, to keep everyone's eyes on the prize. So simple detailing, glass hung on a steel fins that all of these are redundant and load-bearing. We built wood forms to hold the glass panes in place, let them cure for 28 days with structural sealant, and then remove the forms, and everything hangs like big shingles. This is all north-facing light. The first floor is the library and reading area, the community room, and then on the second floor, genealogy department, display of historical artifacts in the librarian's office. And at night, it acts as this nice beacon in the middle of town. And the drawing kind of illustrates what we're doing. The chassis of the building, the brick shell with some of its existing structure, and then the new elements of windows and doors, columns, a skylight over a beacon over an existing skylight, acts as a center, literally for the city center, now marking that. And again, these soap bubble strategies of detailing that provide a very transparent interface between the street and the reading rooms inside, very taut. And then thinking about the inside, we had a press tin ceiling, 100 years old, that we couldn't really penetrate. The mayor got county prisoners to take down each tile and number them, and then those were reconditioned, and they were very resourceful. They were picked up. We had to replace all the columns because they had foundation problems. So you always got to, if you throw a little meat or a little corb in each project, it's really good. It's like Tabasco for architecture. So these transformations, we couldn't penetrate with light, so we wrap with books, we wrap with glass. We put light in here, we bounce the light off the ceiling. They have light in the reading rooms. The old mechanical lift becomes a display for buggies that used to be sold on the top floor and brought down and hooked up to horses. So there's lots of little exhibit areas like this throughout the library. Upstairs, the heartwood pine floors are restored, the librarian's office, the skylight above. And then just taking something as prosaic as a window, simple window, and just reconfiguring it to grab the north light and bounce it in and bring a little kind of spiritual dimension to this library. This was the first winner of a National Library, AIA Library Award in the state of Arkansas. Lots of accolades published and all that. But none of that really, I have to say, in effect, matters. What mattered the most for us is that when we started this project, in the town of 2,500, there were 300 library card holders. Today, there are over 2,300 library card holders in this town. So I think it begins to demonstrate certainly the transformative power of architecture and its ability to, at the very least, strengthen institutions and provide new possibilities on Main Street. The idea of repurposing, we keep thinking about and keep kind of working with in the most kind of constrained of circumstances. Working with an Eastern Orthodox Christian church community who were worshiping in a rundown office building in Springdale, Arkansas. One of their parishioners died, left them some money, so they bought 3.5 acres here, right along the interstate, right around all these mega churches. But they wanted to have their own dignified place to worship and have fellowship as well. For $100 a square foot, they'd asked us to build this for them here, and which was quite a challenge, and that we didn't want to embrace unless we made it out of plywood or something. So, and what you see below here are adventures in religious architecture where I live. So, hang a cross on a metal building. It's a strange thing. I mean, I've seen people on Sundays pull up in here and their SUVs cost more than the building. And certainly people wouldn't live here, so it's a funny place to kind of worship. And I was certainly trying to make my case to the congregation that this is probably not the route we want to go. And they agreed wholeheartedly. But they said, you will have to take this building and convert it into the church. And it's like, wow, our hearts sank, and like, what to do? When in doubt, I always say, try to go back to origins. Go back to the things that are fundamental to what we do as a discipline. And in this particular case, it was scale. It was proportion. It was just simple things that maybe we could make a connection to this very traditional congregation. So we went back to the origins of the classical Greeks and developed a proportioning system. We didn't develop it, it's already developed, the golden mean. Rectangles, you hear it all the time at school, but could it really be useful? But that was the way in which we made a connection as church, because it was the origins of their church. Since we weren't going to be able to afford all the domes and arches and all that stuff, thank goodness. So this is the church that came out of that. And it really begins to embed all the icons and the colors in the facade. The facade, of course, which faces the interstate, acts, not only it's a sort of sacred public face, but acts as a type of billboard for this church. It magnifies its presence in the midst of all these megachurches that it's surrounded by. And this was achieved by simply adding about 10 to 12 feet to the front of the western face of the church to create a narthex that could run north-south, that could get us back on an axis, east-west, that was very important to the congregation, to the rituals of worship. Movable walls that on wheels that open up to allow for overflow in certain services into a fellowship hall with classrooms here. So we just reskinned the existing building. We left it intact, reskinned it with our box-rib metal system. And we course everything out, every window, every door. This is the fire door here. We put the concrete there so we can figure out where it is. But everything is carefully coursed. All the corner trim, like I said, is customized, but it's basically an off-the-rack system that's been amended somewhat. And then, like I say, a little bit of cord here, and then we light it up at night. It becomes this nice billboard in the evening. Section through that addition, Father John's office, the narthex, the St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. Return air duct actually becomes a white oak cabinet, local white oak. There's a steel channel that acts as a beam that supports this cantilever that's filled with sand, and then candles for you pick up as you go beneath the skylight tower and bathed in the blood of Christ before you go inside. So very simple. And then moving into the space, Father John and his congregation, iconostasis made out of angle iron, and we made one cut on the east facade to allow east light to kind of flow in during the morning. And then, the altar and how the light works with the icons and the saints here. One of the big challenges, though, for the church was they had to have a dome. And we explained to them, you cannot put a dome on top of this metal building because you have to cut through the superstructure. Everything falls down. So they allowed us to put a dome on the inside, The problem was we only had $100 a square foot. We didn't have money for a dome. And the contractor didn't feel like he could make one that would be really nice. And he was a member of the church. But he had an idea. He knew a guy that for 2 cases of beer, we could get a satellite dish. And we were in the middle of building this thing, so 20 miles out, this old metal worker had this satellite dish, and we got our company car right here, and we drove that out to the site. It's its own lath, naturally, and we skim coated it in plaster and jacked it up, and they have their dome. So that's how we roll. And one of the building committee men were so excited about this kind of process. He said, I know where we can get a bishop's chair, and I can get it for free. It's walnut, it's big, it's like a throne, and it's got crushed purple velvet on it, upholstery, and I can get it for free. And I said, oh, really, where? And he goes, well, it's from a part of an ad campaign with a local liquor store, but they said I could have it when they're done. He goes, I just don't know what we're going to do with the embroidered CR on it. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, Crown Royal. I was like, wow. And then Father John overheard us, and he came over and he thought about it a minute. He goes, nope, Christ the Redeemer. So, that's how things kind of roll. Anything's possible. We got a phone call from back in 2013 from the National AIA, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Henry. She called to tell us that this had won a National AIA award. And, of course, we were stunned. We thought it would never happen. But she said, we did some research, and we discovered that this is the least expensive building to ever win a National AIA award in the history of the awards program. We wanted y'all to know that. And so it underscored to me what we've been trying to do, and I always try to tell students and architects, is that architecture can happen anywhere. It can happen at any scale. at any budget, and don't let anyone tell you any different, because what we're learning right here, you can't put a price on. And I think a little structure like this can prove that out. So I'd like to end tonight with a kind of not this. So this is under construction, actually under wraps. Now this is a pediatrician clinic for kids. So we thought we'd only have 3 colors in our palette: red, blue, and yellow. So we thought we'd make a red building, and it sits in a suburban landscape here. So this is kind of carrying forth some of these ideas of the silhouette, the icon in the landscape, with a nice blue stairway up to the clinic, and then a place for the doctors to sleep that are on call all the time. So they're up in here, right here, and then you're transitioning here, and then spec offices down below. So kind of keep pushing that idea that the power of just the silhouette in the landscape. But the last building I want to show you is an architecture school, the Fay Jones School of Architecture. I was very fortunate to receive the commission along with Polk Stanley Wilcox in Arkansas to renovate of an older building, much like this building, built in the 30s. I think this one's much older than that, but built in the 30s, where our architecture school had been for 40 years. It's a Beaux-Arts building, but we never had room for landscape or interiors, so this is an opportunity to get everybody under one roof and to add 35,000 square feet to it. So it's a 100,000 square foot project, and a great opportunity, again, to look at how we take the DNA of something that exists and speculate on how it might evolve, and then search for that condition of resonance between the two. So this is the east face of that Beaux-Arts building. The only requirement by the university was that the new addition would have to be the same width and length of the existing. And so that was a challenge, and we were to be able to add to the west side. And to achieve this, we were really going to have to core out the middle of the building, because that's the place where you could never get to, because it used to be filled with books, 7-foot ceilings. There was a central axis that you could never thoroughly experience. This is right in the middle of campus, so we basically core out the center, reprogram that, and then we add the new addition here, which creates the new figure in the middle of the campus. And again, we're using pretty much the same proportional systems and regulating lines to really begin to inform how we scale the addition, as well as the materials, but using new technologies. This is a limestone rain screen panel system that complements the limestone system that exists with post-tension concrete. So the idea was to make something that weighed literally in tons as much as the existing did. So rather than steel and gypboard and light metal and so forth, that would, where fear was that it would look like a box kite attached to this, that we'd have something that would act as a balancing counterweight to the existing. And then the west elevation, which really came about through thinking of this as an inverted figure ground diagram of the existing building. So thinking of the existing building with its fenestration as figures and the mass of the building as the ground, through technology, through new ways of thinking about space and form, we can actually make the building the figure and the fenestration the ground. And this really becomes a didactic moment for our students, a learning opportunity between how we used to build and how we can build today. And that was something that the Design Review Board bought into, thankfully, and allowed us to proceed ahead. And then we light it up at night, so it acts as this type of jellyfish, and you can really begin to see what's going on inside, because as we all know, being here in Slocum, everybody wonders what the hell is going on in there. It's all lit up all the time, and you can't see in and all this. So this is our way of opening it up to the community, the larger community of the university, and then creating a new entrance on the west side, and really opening up that axis that runs all the way from Arkansas Avenue through Old Main, through our building, through the library, through the plaza, the Union, and all the way to the football stadium. So now it's something that becomes a throughway for everybody in the community. And we had to remove several 100-year-old oak trees from the new addition. So we were very careful about how we cut those, limbed them, carved them into lumber, and then repurposed them as a 5.5-foot by 25-foot long tableau that sits in the center axes of the school, really becomes part of the social space of the school, and a series of vitrines along the axes to display student work and announcements. So it's a very kind of active social spine of the school that runs all the way through and allows the public to interface as well. In the basement level, we've got all the it's the candy store like you have here, the shop, the Viz Lab, the vacuum machines, the 3D printers, as well as in the new component, these exposed concrete studios in the lower level. The upper level, we have our own exhibition gallery that can be secured for the first time. Our first show was a retrospective of Faye Jones, and then reconditioned windows and plaster for the new studios in the old building. On the second floor, the old reading room here is converted into a studio here with custom lighting, custom desks with built-in LED strips, new classrooms, as well as the central gallery that pretty much like you have here, where all our major reviews take place, and it's the main kind of nerve center of the school. So this is really where the old and new kind of overlap here. And this was a space that we had a lot of acoustic problems and lighting problems. To resolve that, we worked with a NewMat system, which is a fabric ceiling that could be stretched across the entire 2,500 square feet of the room, backlit. It was like a giant lampshade, and then skylit on the sides. And this fabric is perforated, so it resolves the acoustical issues. And then we took out this west wall and then rebuilt it to match the existing detailing of the older building. And then carved an oculus through the new studios we added on top, so that they would have a window to the sky in the middle of the school that becomes very dynamic as the sun and moves. It always registers another quality of light depending on what's going on outside. And so, just nice restoration of existing older spaces. And then one slit right through here that allows all these rolling panels to slip out, be stored away, convert this into a more multi-purpose space. Tried to figure out how to deal with a 200-foot long west-facing facade, how to deal with the sun control, and it became very evident that we wanted to deal with it passively. So we worked with a company out of St. Louis to develop a fritted glass fin brise-soleil and a custom curtain wall system, all made out of steel sections that we could manufacture locally about 10 miles away to complement the existing steel sashes of the older building. And then developed ways of looking at the daylighting. This really became something that students and a professor worked on, this and the acoustics, so it became, again, another learning opportunity. And then this is the brise-soleil, that one big window that acts to really give us north light and control the sun, but also control, kind of soften the views of Albert Speer comes to Arkansas here. So. And again, just exposing the post-tension concrete, and then at night it just really gets to open up and allow for that transparency. To create the formal joint between the old and the new, we use that joint to fill with program, which is the required new exit stairs for the building, that act as vitrines and social spaces here. Then more crit and review spaces, decentralized all the printing, because all that's behind these sliding doors. All the plotters are in each studio now. The sinks, our auditorium. Again, we only have one color. This happens to be the school colors of Arkansas, so the chancellor was quite happy about it. But a two-story auditorium with folks here. So a grand learning space, and then our student lounge underneath the rake of this. Here we call it the boneless chicken ranch, because every time you come in, the students are all sacked out in the beanbag chairs. We have showers so they can take showers. Problem with that is we had 2 students living there rent-free, that we had to kind of monitor that a little bit better. But it's a split-screen system. This came up because I was teaching at Cornell, and I really liked the new addition there quite a bit, but it's kind of sad that the first 5 rows of the auditorium you can't sit because they didn't resolve that. So we have 2 screens here, and that allowed us to steal some space behind this screen and have a faculty lounge to where faculty can go and gossip about the students. And then up top, green roof, Ozark Sedum Laboratory, faculty offices, seminar rooms, a covered outdoor classroom with a place of refuge and prospect. Yeah. And then finally at night, the whole kind of lineage of buildings over a timeline, our first building, our second building, and on down the line. And the last space that I always try to turn the students on to, I tell, when they've been up for a few nights straight, rather than drink 5 Red Bulls, I just tell them to go upstairs, stare into the Oculus, get charged up, get ready to go, right? So, anyways, I really appreciate the opportunity to come back here to Syracuse. I want to say that my education under the program here was transformative for me, and I think the opportunity to teach here was even more of a shaper of who I am and how I think, and I appreciate those opportunities, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. I may have talked too long. Do they do questions here? Okay. Looks like they all want to go.
This is wait for them, it's a little settling.
Yeah. I can only take 3 questions, so I only have a couple more hours I can spend with you. So.
First of all, I'd like to admit, probably rather shamefully, that I said you recognize your name, but the Carton Jesus Club kind of brought back the memories of seeing your lecture about 4 years ago at the University of Illinois. So it's kind of pleasant to see how your work has evolved, and in fact, it's actually some of your projects have been on board since. But for a question, color has a lot of inherent meaning, and so I'm kind of curious at how you see your firm as 3 colors, and what are sort of the ideas behind these 3 colors, and do you see meanings behind them? And a red hospital might be a little scandalous. So
Yeah.
For instance.
Yeah, well, it's not blood red. So it's called cayenne red, which is kind of orange red, and that is a color that Warren Seagraves, who's a very well-known modernist architect in our neck of the woods, used on his buildings, and so we've used it before. So yeah, we thought about that, but the doctor is all pumped up because he wants to. He said, he wants to create a kind of icon that kids can readily identify with, when they come, something that would just come to life under the light. So we don't really think of it so much symbolically. We looked at it in blue, we looked at it in green, and we let the owner really decide, and that's kind of how we went with that. But red for us is a sort of a, I don't know, it's kind of dumb. It's just an accent. And obviously for the church, it was symbolic, right? The blood of Christ, blue, the unrequited light of God, yellow, the light of God, those sorts of things. And they have a lot of other meanings attached to that. In the school, Fay Jones School of Architecture, Fay Jones, Frank Lloyd Wright, red, of course, was Wright's kind of color in many ways, the red square, which Fay also used for his firm, and then we are the Razorbacks, which we're red. So what I'm saying? So it's opportunistic in a way, how to insert color, but I think it would be foolhardy of me to say, okay, we're going to do all this color here when I have no real expertise in color. So I usually defer to my partner for that when we do it. But for us, color mostly, like I'm looking in this room right now, and all the color is coming from y'all, right? Not so much from the room, and I think that's great. So it's just not someplace where we go too far. So I like to say a few colors versus any color or many colors. I don't know if that answers your question. But we'll find out about the doctor thing. It could be a scandal, I don't know. But I'm hoping we've been working with it's a custom paint on the Kynar finish that we've been working for 6 months trying to perfect so that it doesn't wash out in the sun and all that. So hopefully we'll get it right, and like I say, we won't turn off too many people. So. Who else? Yes.
Marlon, that was great, thank you. Actually, maybe to share a bit your process, I think that the typological diagrams are very clear, and there's a deep investment in typology, and obviously also a deep investment in, say, material culture, and a lot of distance between those two. So just give us some sense of how the office works and how you work between abstract typological diagrams and final results.
Final results, yeah. Well, everything usually starts with a 9B pencil, yellow trace, and there's lots of problem setting that goes on, like what is the problem here, and trying to work your way through that. And we tend to front end our materials and our sort of material logics are embedded in the schematics. So we're already thinking about how that is a part of the expressive character. So it has content already. So the materials and things aren't just applied, but they're woven in very early on. We have subcontractors in our office in the middle of schematics, kind of saying, can we do this? How much would it cost? Help us out. And so, because we know enough to know that we don't know, so we spend time with these folks. And we develop a really good relationship with them because it's mutual respect and get their buy-in. So that's a big part of it. I think of most things as a visage, buildings. Like I say, as a cartoonist, I drew everything in profile, and that's kind of how I work in architecture. I start with a section and the profile, and whether it's long or across, transverse, I'm always thinking about that sectional quality of whatever we do and how that may translate into something that's more of a face for the building, so the expressive part of the building as well. So a lot of that's left to I take care of, but then I have all the folks in my office, which are pretty amazing, who are really good at beginning to understand the language, of how we might bring that into some kind of tangible reality. And it's a process that is non-linear, I would argue. But a lot of times, like with the museum store, I was like, damn it, I'm tired of walking around and seeing all the fabrication stuff. And, a lot of folks in my school, they're really good talking about it, but they don't make anything. And I'm thinking, well, why can't we just make this in a project? Why does it only have to be reserved for the academy or for, kind of obscure things? Why couldn't this really be done? And so, there's nothing magical about it. It's just we had to find somebody who had a 3-axis CNC and test it with our BIM models and figure out how to mill everything in it. So that process is a form of research that I think makes it fun. I mean, it makes it, I wouldn't say fun. We had this talk last night at dinner. It's hard-loving work, right? But I don't really think of architecture as fun. I guess I think of it as work, but pleasurable work. But that gets an investment from the folks in the firm to get their buy-in and to get them involved in the project. So I don't know. I don't think it's anything real theoretical that I'm doing here, other than being a very careful observer and reinterpreting the world as it's given to us. I think that's very keen on our mind. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It's very interesting to see the variety of the projects you've shown us,
Yeah.
and showing how you've taken your
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's, I think the idea is to negotiate the local and the universal. And the thing that I left out on Ted's question is that one of the reasons I went back to graduate school is I felt like I had ideas, but I had no real way to express them. And, you know, I needed a formal language. I needed a way, like grammar, you know, like, and I needed to learn that. And I spent a lot of time in graduate school and since learning, in my view, the language of our discipline, you know, whether it's the more contemporary language, but really understanding how things transition together, how form works, how it's, what makes it legible and understandable, and what works from scale of the hand to the scale of the city, right? Because it has to work at all of those scales, I think, to be really great. Too often we short circuit that. We get sidetracked with topics like social justice or, you know, sustainable best practices and all. Those are all great, no problem. But they're not a substitute for understanding the language of your discipline. I mean, you can have your best intentions, and then when you drop a swirly on the landscape, you know, whose fault is that? You know, I would tell folks that it's like, no client, no patrons ever come to me or any other architect and said, please design me a really ill-proportioned, unresolved, out-of-scale, non-functional project, and I'll pay you for it. You know, that's what architects are supposed to be doing, right? So I feel very strongly about learning that, and that that's a lifelong pursuit. To answer the question more directly, yes, can it happen in these other places? I believe it can, and I believe it does. I can't name you like precise projects, but I know I look at the work of Seligmann, for example, in Chile, who I think is one of the best architects out there, and he is very capable of leveraging, you know, kind of the local typologies into a more universal discourse, and that's what I think is powerful stuff, right? It keeps it from being, how would you say, autonomous, you know, and I think that's what we're trying to avoid. Yes, sir.
We have time for just one more question.
Yes, sir. This fellow had his hand up earlier.
I just wanted to thank you also for putting up some lecture. It was definitely really interesting. And as a Southern designer myself, I'm from Tennessee. And
All right.
I saw that a lot of the scenery that you showed was very familiar to my eyes. And I was wondering if there were other typologies that you observed in the Southern landscape that inspired your work. I know that where I come from, there's immense development of real estate with regards to suburban life and houses. That sort of thing. I was wondering if that at all affected your practice or if that's
Yes. Trailer homes, semi-truck trailers, you know, campers, all that other flotsam and jetsam that you find in the landscape, along with all the icons of the barn and the silo and all that stuff that makes up the fractured American landscape. All that stuff has a real effect on how we look at it. And so much of it is in that transition of becoming, moving from what is rural to suburban, right, to perhaps ultimately urban, who knows, and just being very conscious of that. I think it has a direct effect on what we do. And it is the source, as I've stated before, of where a lot of the formal propositions that we have come from. I mean, we're not just pulling these out of our back pocket, but they're already there.
Thank you, Marlon.
Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it.